Executives from Facebook, Twitter, and Google testified on Capitol Hill about efforts to counter online terror content, hate speech, and misinformation on their platforms. They also discussed foreign interference in U.S. elections. This House Homeland Security Committee hearing is 2.5 hours.
The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on examining social media companies' efforts to counter online terror content and misinformation. In March, a white supremacist terrorist killed 51 people and wounded 49 more at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Our thoughts and prayers continue to be with the victims and their families. The motive behind the attack is not in question. The terrorist had written an extensive manifesto outlining his white supremacist, white nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and fascist beliefs. His act was horrifying beyond words, and it shook the conscience. Shockingly, the terrorist was able to live stream the attack on Facebook, where the video and its gruesome content went undetected initially. Instead, law enforcement officials in New Zealand had to contact the company and ask that it be removed. When New Zealand authorities called on all social media companies to remove these videos immediately, they were unable to comply. Human moderators could not keep up with the volume of videos being reposted, and their automated systems were unable to recognize minor changes in the video. So the video spread online and spread around the world. The fact that this happened nearly 2 years after Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, and other major tech companies established the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or pronounced GIFCT, is troubling to say the least. The GIFCT was created for tech companies to share technology and best practices to combat the spread of online terrorist content. Back in July 2017, representatives of the GIFCT briefed this committee on this new initiative. At the time, I was optimistic about its intentions and goals and acknowledged that its members demonstrated initiative and willingness to engage on this issue while others have not. But after a while, and white supremacist terrorists were able to exploit social media platforms in this way, we all have reason to doubt the effectiveness of the GIFCT and the company's efforts more broadly. On March 27th of this year, representatives of GIFCT briefed this committee after the Christchurch massacre. Since then, myself and other members of this committee have asked important questions about the organization and your companies and have yet to receive satisfactory answers. Today, I hope to get answers regarding your actual efforts to keep terrorist content off your platforms. I want to know how you prevent content like the New Zealand attack video from spreading on your platforms again. This committee will continue to engage social media companies about the challenges they face in addressing terror content on their platforms. In addition to terror content, I want to hear from our panel about how they are working to keep hate speech and harmful misinformation off their platforms. I want to be very clear. Democrats respect the free speech rights enshrined in the First Amendment, but much of the content I'm referring to is either not protected speech or violates the social media companies' own terms of service. We've seen time and time again that social media platforms are vulnerable to being exploited by bad actors, including those working at the behest of foreign governments who seek to sow discord by spreading misinformation. This problem will only become more acute as we approach the 2020 elections. We want to understand how companies can strengthen their efforts to deal with the persistent problem. At the fundamental level, today's hearing is about transparency. We want to get an understanding of whether and to what extent social media companies are incorporating questions of national security, public safety, and integrity of our domestic institutions into their business model. I look forward to having that conversation with the witnesses here today and to our ongoing dialogue on behalf of the American people. I thank the witnesses for joining us and the members for their participation. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Concerns about violent and terror-related online content has existed since the creation of the internet. This issue has peaked over the past decade with the growing sophistication in which foreign terrorists and their global supporters have exploited the openness of online platforms to radicalize, mobilize, and promote their violent messages. These tactics proved successful, so much so that we are seeing domestic extremists mimic many of the same techniques to gather followers and spread hateful, violent propaganda. Public pressure has grown steadily on the social media companies to modify their terms of service to limit posts linked to terrorism, violence, criminal activity, and most recently, the hateful rhetoric of misinformation. The large and mainstream companies have responded to this pressure in a number of ways, including the creation of the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, or GIFT-CT. They are also updating their terms of service and hiring more human content moderators. Today's hearing is also an important opportunity to examine the constitutional limits placed on the government to regulate or restrict free speech. Advocating violent acts and recruiting terrorists online is illegal, but expressing one's political views, however repugnant they may be, is protected under the First Amendment. I was deeply concerned to hear the recent news reports about Google's policy regarding President Trump and conservative news media. Google's head of responsible innovation, Jen Janai, recently said, quote, "We all got screwed over in 2016. The people got screwed over. The news media got screwed over. Everybody got screwed over. So we've rapidly been like, what happened there? How do we prevent this from happening again?" Close quote. Then Ms. Janai, again on video, remarked, quote, "Elizabeth Warren is saying that we should break up Google. That will not make it better. It will make it worse, because all these smaller companies that don't have the same resources that we do will be charged with preventing the next Trump situation," close quote. Now, Ms. Janai is entitled to her opinion, but we're in trouble if her opinions are Google's policy. That same report details alarming claims about Google's deliberate attempt to alter search results to reflect the reality Google wants to promote rather than objective facts. This report and others like it are a stark reminder of why founders created the First Amendment. In fact, the video I just quoted from has been removed from YouTube. That platform is owned by Google, who is joining us here today. I have serious questions about Google's ability to be fair and balanced when it appears they've colluded with YouTube to silence negative press coverage. Regulating speech quickly becomes a subjective exercise for government or the private sector. Noble intentions often give way to bias and political agendas. The solution to this problem is complex. It will involve enhanced cooperation between the government, industry, individuals, while protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans. I appreciate our witnesses' participation here today. I hope that today's hearing can be helpful in providing greater transparency and understanding of this complex challenge. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Ms. Monica Bickert, is the Vice President for Global Policy Management at Facebook. Next, we're joined by Mr. Nick Pickles, who currently serves as a Global Senior Strategist for Public Policy at Twitter. Our third witness is Mr. Derek Slater, the Global Director of Information Policy at Google. Finally, we welcome Ms. Nadine Stronson, who serves as the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I'll now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Bickert.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the committee. And thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm Monica Bickert, Facebook's Vice President for Global Policy Management, and I'm in charge of our product policy and counterterrorism efforts. Before I joined Facebook, I prosecuted federal crimes for 11 years at the Department of Justice. On behalf of our company, I want to thank you for your leadership combating extremism, terrorism, and other threats to our homeland and national security. I'd also like to start by saying that all of us at Facebook stand with the victims, their families, and everyone affected by the recent terror attacks, including the horrific violence in Sri Lanka and New Zealand. In the aftermath of these acts, it's even more important to stand together against hate and violence. And we make this a priority in everything that we do at Facebook. On terrorist content, our view is simple. There's absolutely no place on Facebook for terrorists. They're not allowed to use our services under any circumstances. We remove their accounts as soon as we find them. We also remove any content that praises or supports terrorists or their actions. And if we find evidence of imminent harm, we promptly inform authorities. There are 3 primary ways that we are implementing this approach. First, with our products that help stop terrorists and their propaganda at the gates. Second, through our people who help us review terrorist content and implement our policies. And third, through our partnerships outside the company, which help us stay ahead of the threat. So first, our products. Facebook has invested significantly in technology to help identify terrorist content, including through the use of artificial intelligence, but also using other automation and technology. For instance, we can now identify violating textual posts in 19 different languages. With the help of these improvements, we have taken action on more than 25 million pieces of terrorist content since the beginning of 2018. Of the content that we have removed from Facebook for violating our terrorism policies, more than 99% of that is content that we found ourselves using our own technical tools before anybody has reported it to us. Second, our people. We now have more than 30,000 people who are working on safety and security across Facebook, across the world. And that is 3 times as many people as we had dedicated to those efforts in 2017. We also have more than 300 highly trained professionals exclusively or primarily focused on combating terrorist use of our services. Our team includes counterterrorism experts, former prosecutors like myself, former law enforcement officials, former intelligence officials. And together, they speak more than 50 languages, and they are able to provide 24-hour coverage. Finally, our partnerships. In addition to working with third-party intelligence providers to more quickly identify terrorist material on the internet, we also regularly work with academics who are studying terrorism and the latest trends, and government officials. Following the tragic attacks in New Zealand, Facebook was proud to be a signatory to the Christchurch Call to Action, which is a 9-point plan for the industry to better combat terrorist attempts to use our services. We also partner across industry. As Mr. Chairman and the Ranking Member mentioned, in 2017, we launched the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFCT, with YouTube, Microsoft, and Twitter. GIFCT, the point of that is we bring companies together from across industry to share information and also to share technology and research to better combat these threats. Through GIFCT, we've expanded an industry database for companies to share what we call hashes, which are basically digital fingerprints of terrorist content, so that we can all remove it more quickly and help smaller companies do that too. We've also trained over 110 companies from around the globe in best practices for counting terrorist use of the internet. Now, Facebook took over as the chair of GIFCT in 2019, and along with our fellow members, we have this year worked to expand our capabilities including making new audio and text hashing techniques available to other member companies, especially these smaller companies. And we've also improved our crisis protocols. In the wake of the horrific Christchurch attacks, we communicated in real time across our companies and were able to stop hundreds of versions of the video of the attack, despite the fact that bad actors were actively trying to edit the video to upload it to circumvent our systems. We know that our adversaries are always evolving their tactics, and we have to improve if we want to stay ahead. And though we'll never be perfect, we've made real progress, and we are committed to tirelessly combating extremism on our platform. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today to discuss these important issues of combating terrorist content online and manipulation of the public conversation. We keep the victims...
Turn your mic on, please.
It's on.
You pull the mic closer to you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That better? Thank you. We keep the victims, their families, and the affected communities of the attack in Christchurch and around the world in our minds as we undertake this important work. We have made the health of Twitter our top priority and measure our efforts by how successfully we encourage healthy debate, conversations, and critical thinking on the platform. Conversely, hateful conduct, terrorist content, and deceptive practices detract from the health of the platform. I'd like to begin by outlining 3 key policies. Firstly, Twitter takes a zero-tolerance approach to terrorist content on our platform. Individuals may not promote terrorism, engage in terrorist recruitment, or terrorist acts. Since 2015, we've suspended more than 1.5 million accounts for violations of our rules related to the promotion of terrorism, and continue to see more than 90% of these accounts suspended through proactive measures. In the majority of cases, we take action at the account creation stage, before an account has even tweeted. The remaining 10% is identified through a combination of user reports and partnerships. Secondly, we prohibit the use of Twitter by violent extremist groups. These are defined in our rules as groups who, whether by their statements on or off the platform, promote violence against civilians or use violence against civilians to further their cause, whatever their ideology. Since the introduction of this policy in 2017, we've taken action on 184 groups globally and permanently suspended more than 2,000 unique accounts. Thirdly, Twitter does not allow hateful conduct on its service. An individual on Twitter is not permitted to promote violence or directly attack or threaten people based on protected characteristics. Where any of these rules are broken, we will take action to remove the content and will permanently remove those who promote terrorism or violent extremist groups from Twitter. As you've heard, Twitter is a member of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, a partnership between YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Microsoft that facilitates information sharing and technical cooperation across industry, as well as providing essential support for smaller companies. We learned a number of lessons from the Christchurch attacks. The distribution of media was manifestly different from how IS or other terror organizations have worked. This reflects a change in the wider threat environment that requires a renewed approach and a focus on crisis response. After Christchurch, an array of individuals online sought to continuously re-upload the content created by the attacker, both the video and the manifesto. The broader internet ecosystem presented then and still presents a challenge we cannot avoid. A range of third-party services were used to share content, including some forums and websites that have long hosted some of the most egregious content available online. Our analysis found that 70% of the views of the video posted by the Christchurch attacker came from verified accounts on Twitter, including news organizations and individuals posting the video to condemn the attack. We're committed to learning and improving, but every entity has a part to play. We should also take some heart from the social examples we've seen on Twitter around the world as users come together to challenge hate and challenge division. Hashtags like Pray for Orlando, Je suis Charlie, or after the Christchurch attack, Hello Brother, reject terrorist narratives and offer a better future for us all. In the months since the attack, governments, industry, and civil society have united behind our mutual commitments to a safe, secure, open, and global internet. In fulfilling our commitment to the Christchurch call, we will take a wide range of actions, including to continue investing in technology so we can respond as quickly as possible to a future incident. Let me now turn to our approach to dealing with attempts to manipulate the public conversation. As a uniquely open service, Twitter enables the clarification of falsehoods in real time. We proactively enforce policies and use technology to halt the spread of content propagated through manipulated tactics. Our rules clearly prohibit coordinated account manipulation, malicious automation, and fake accounts. We continue to explore how we may take further action through both policy and product on these types of issues in the future. We continue to critically examine additional safeguards we can implement to protect the health of the conversation occurring on Twitter. We look forward to working with the committee on these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Slater to summarize his testimony for 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I appreciate your leadership on the important issues of radicalization and misinformation online, and welcome the opportunity to discuss Google's work in these areas. My name is Derek Slater, and I'm the Global Director of Information Policy at Google. In my role, I lead a team that advises the company on public policy frameworks for online content. At Google, we believe that the internet has been a force for creativity, learning, and access to information. Supporting the free flow of ideas is core to our mission, to organize and make the world's information universally accessible and useful. Yet there have always been legitimate limits, even where laws strongly protect free expression. This is true both online and off, especially when it comes to issues of terrorism, hate speech, and misinformation. We take these issues seriously and want to be a part of the solution. In my testimony today, I will focus on 2 areas where we are making progress to help protect our users. First, on the enforcement of our policies around terrorism and hate speech, and second, in combating misinformation broadly. On YouTube, we have rigorous policies and programs to defend against the use of our platform to spread hate or incite violence. Over the past 2 years, we have invested heavily in machines and people to quickly identify and remove content that violates our policies. First, YouTube's enforcement system starts from the point at which a user uploads a video. If it is somewhat similar to videos that already violate our policies, it is sent for humans to review. If they determine that it violates our policies, they remove it, and the system makes a digital fingerprint so it can't be uploaded again. In the first quarter of 2019, over 75% of the more than 8 million videos removed were first flagged by a machine, the majority of which were removed before a single view was received. Second, we also rely on experts to find videos that the algorithm might be missing. Some of these experts sit at our Intel desk, which proactively looks for new trends in content that might violate our policies. We also allow expert NGOs and governments to notify us of bad content in bulk through our Trusted Flagger program. Finally, we go beyond enforcing our policies by creating programs to promote counter-speech. Examples of this work include our Creators for Change program, which supports YouTube creators that are acting as positive role models. In addition, Alphabet's Jigsaw Group has deployed the redirect method, which uses targeted ads and videos to disrupt online radicalization. This broad and cross-sectional work has led to tangible results. In the first quarter of 2019, YouTube manually reviewed over 1 million suspected terrorist videos and found that only fewer than 10%, about 90,000, violated our terrorism policy. As a comparison point, we typically remove between 7 and 9 million videos per quarter, which is a tiny fraction of a percent of YouTube's total views during this time period. Our efforts do not stop there. We are constantly taking input and reacting to new situations. For example, YouTube recently further updated its hate speech policy. Updated policy specifically prohibits videos alleging that a group is superior in order to justify discrimination, segregation, or exclusion based on qualities like age, gender, race, caste, religion, sexual orientation, or veteran status. Similarly, the recent tragic events in Christchurch presented some unprecedented challenges. In response, we took more drastic measures, such as automatically rejecting new uploads of videos without waiting for human review to check if it was news content. We are now re-examining our crisis protocols and have also signed the Christchurch call to action. Finally, we are deeply committed to working with government, the tech industry, and experts from civil society and academia to protect our services from being exploited by bad actors, including during Google's chairmanship of the GIFCT over the last year and a half. On the topic of combating misinformation, we have a natural long-term incentive to prevent anyone from interfering with the integrity of our products. We also recognize that it is critically important to combat misinformation in the context of democratic elections, when our users seek accurate, trusted information that will help them make critical decisions. We have worked hard to curb misinformation in our products, and our efforts include designing better ranking algorithms, implementing tougher policies against monetization of misrepresentative content, and deploying multiple teams that identify and take action against malicious actors. At the same time, we have to be mindful that our platforms reflect a broad array of sources and information, and there are important free speech considerations. There is no silver bullet, but we will continue to work to get it right. In conclusion, we want to do everything we can to ensure users are not exposed to harmful content. We understand these are difficult issues of serious interest to the committee. We take them seriously, want to be responsible actors who do our part. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Strawson to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Rogers and members. So sorry. Thank you so much, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Rogers and other members of the committee. My name is Nadine Strawson. I am a professor of law at New York Law School and the immediate past president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Of great pertinence, last year I wrote a book which is directly pertinent to the topic of this hearing called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. I note, Mr. Chairman, that you referred to hate speech as problematic content in addition with terror content and misinformation. All of these kinds of speech, while potentially harmful, present enormous dangers when we empower either government or private companies to censor and suppress the speech for this reason. The concepts of hate speech, terrorist content, and misinformation are all irreducibly vague and broad, therefore having to be enforced according to the subjective discretion of the enforcing authorities. And the discretion has been enforced in ways that both suppress speech that does pose a serious danger, as a number of the members, as the chairman pointed out and the ranking member pointed out, but also do suppress very important speech, as also has been pointed out, speech that actually counters terrorism and other dangers. What's worse is that in addition to violating free speech and democracy norms, these measures are not ineffective in dealing with the underlying problems. And I thought that was something that was pointed out by comments by my co-panelists, in particular, Nick Pickles' testimony, written testimony, talked about the fact that if somebody is driven off one of these platforms, they will then take refuge in darker corners of the web where it is much harder to engage with them, to use them as sources of information for law enforcement and counterterrorism investigations. So we should emphasize other approaches that are consistent with free speech and democracy, but have been lauded as at least as effective and perhaps even more so than suppression. I was very heartened that the written statements of my co-panelists all emphasize these other approaches. Monica Bickert's testimony talked about how essential it is to go after the root causes of terrorism, and the testimony of Nick Pickles and Derek Slater also emphasized the importance of counter speech, counter narratives, and redirection. Now, I recognize that every single one of us in this room is completely committed to free speech and democracy, just as every single one of us is committed to countering terrorism and disinformation. After all, the reason we oppose terrorism and disinformation is precisely because of the harm that they do to democracy and liberty. Before I say anything further, I do have to stress something that I know everybody here knows, but many members of the public do not, that these social media companies are not bound by the First Amendment free speech guarantee. So none of us has a free speech right to air any content on their platforms at all. Conversely, they have their own free speech rights to choose what will be and what will not be on their platforms. So it would be unconstitutional, of course, for Congress to purport to tell them what they must put up and what they must take down, to the extent that the takedowns would go beyond First Amendment unprotected speech. And Chairman Thompson, you did completely accurately, of course, note that much of the content that is targeted as terrorist is unprotected, but much of it is protected under the Constitution, and much of it is very valuable, including human rights advocacy that has been suppressed under these necessarily overbroad and subjective standards. Although the social media companies do not have a constitutional obligation to honor freedom of speech, given their enormous power, it is incredibly important that they be encouraged to do so. And in closing, I'm going to quote a statement from the written testimony of Nick Pickles, which I could not agree with more, when he said that we will not solve the problems by removing content alone. We should not underestimate the power of open conversation to change minds, perspectives, and behaviors. Thank you very much.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony, and I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I'll now recognize myself for questions. Misinformation is some of this committee's challenges as it relates to this hearing, as well as the terrorist content. Let's take, for instance, the recent doctored video of Speaker Nancy Pelosi that made her appear to be drunk or slurring her words. Facebook and Twitter left up the video, but YouTube took it down. Everybody agreed that something was wrong with it. Facebook, again, took a different approach. So I want Ms. Bickert and Mr. Pickles to explain how you decided the process for leaving this video up on Facebook and Twitter. And then Mr. Slater, I want you to explain to me why YouTube decided to take it down. Ms. Bickert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me first say, misinformation is a top concern for us, especially as we're getting ready for the 2020 elections. We know this is something that we have to get right. And we're especially focused on what we should be doing with increasingly sophisticated, manipulated media. So let me first speak to our general approach with misinformation, which is we remove content when it violates our community standards. Beyond that, if we see somebody that is sharing misinformation, we want to make sure that we are reducing the distribution and also providing accurate information from independent fact-checking organizations so that people can put in context what they see. To do that, we work with 45 independent fact-checking organizations from around the world, each of which is certified by Pointer as being independent and meeting certain principles. And as soon as we find something that those fact-checking organizations rate false on our platform, we dramatically reduce the distribution and we put next to it related articles so that anybody who shares that gets a warning that this has been rated false. Anybody who did share it before we got the fact checkers rating gets a notification that the content was has now been rated false by a fact checker, and we're putting next to it those related articles from the fact checking organizations.
I understand. How long did it take you to do that for the Pelosi video?
The Pelosi video was uploaded to Facebook on Wednesday, May 22nd, around late morning, and on Thursday, Around 6:30 p.m., a fact-checking organization rated it as false, and we immediately downranked it and put information next to it. And that's something where we think we need to get faster. We need to make sure that we are getting this information to people as soon as we can. It is also a reason that at 6:30 p.m.
So it took you about a day and a half.
Yes, it did, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Pickles.
So as Monica said, the process for us is we review this against our rules. Any content that breaks our rules, we will remove. We're also very aware that people use manipulated tactics to spread this content, fake accounts, automation. So we'll take action on the distribution as well as the content. This is a policy area we're looking at right now, not just in the case of where videos might be manipulated, but also where the videos are fabricated, where the whole process of creating media may be artificial. We think that the best way to approach this is with a policy and a product approach that covers, in some cases, removing.
I understand, but just get to why you left it up.
So at present, the video doesn't break our rules, and then the account posting it doesn't break our rules, but it's absolutely a policy area we're looking at right now about whether our rules and our products are the correct framework for dealing with this challenge.
So if it's false or misinformation, that doesn't break your rules?
Not at present, no.
Thank you. Mr. Slater.
So on YouTube, we have tough community guidelines to lay out the rules of the road, what's inbounds to be up on the platform, what's out, and violative content. When it is identified to us via machines or users, we will review and remove. In this case, the video in question violated our policies around deceptive practices, and we removed it.
So again, our committee is tasked with looking at misinformation and some other things. We're not trying to regulate companies, but terrorist content can also be a manipulated document. And so, Ms. Strawson, talk to us about your position with that.
The difficulty in the inherent subjectivity of these concepts, Chairman Thompson, is illustrated by the fact that we have 3 companies that have subscribed to essentially the same general commitments and yet are interpreting the details very differently with respect to specific content. We see that over and over again. Ultimately, the only protection that we are going to have in this society against disinformation is training and education, starting at the earliest levels of a child's education in media literacy, because Congress could never protect against misinformation in traditional media, right? Unless it meets the very strict standards of defamation that is punishable and fraud that is punishable. Content, including the Pelosi video, is completely constitutionally protected in other media.
Thank you. I yield to the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Slater, the video I referenced in my comments with Ms. Janai and your employee, would you like to take this opportunity? Have you seen it?
Congressman, I have not seen the full video, but I'm broadly aware of what you're talking about, yes.
Okay, would you like to take an opportunity to respond to the comments that I offered about what was said?
Could you be specific, Congressman? What would you like me to respond
When
to?
she basically, for example, said that we can't let Google be broken up because these smaller companies won't have the same resources we have to stop Trump from getting reelected.
Thank you for the clarification. So let me be clear. This employee was recorded without her consent. I believe these statements were taken out of context. But stepping back to our policies, how we address the issue you're talking about. No employee, whether in the lower ranks up to senior executives, has the ability to manipulate our search results based on our products or our services, based on their political ideology. We design, develop our products for everyone. We mean everyone. And we do that to provide relevant results, authoritative results. We are in the trust business. We have a long-term incentive to get that right. And we do that in a transparent fashion. You can read more on our House Search Work site. We have search rater guidelines that are public on the web that describe how we look at rating. We have robust systems and checks and balances in place to make sure that those are rigorously adhered to as we set up our systems.
Okay, I recognize that she was being videotaped without her knowledge, but the statements that I quoted from were full, complete statements that were not edited. So it is concerning when you see somebody who's an executive with Google, and there were more than one in that video, by the way, making statements that indicate that it's management's policy within Google to try to manipulate information to cause one or another candidate for president of the United States, or for that matter, any other office, to be successful or not be successful. So that is what gave rise to my concern. Do we have reason to be concerned that Google has a pervasive nature in the company to try to push one political party over another in the way it conducts its business?
Congressman, I appreciate the concern, but let me be clear again, in terms of what our policy is, from the highest levels on down, and what our practices and structures and checks and balances are about. We do not allow anyone, lower level, higher level, to manipulate our products in that way.
Okay. I hope it's not the culture at any of your platforms, because you are very powerful in our country. Ms. Strawson, you raised concerns in your testimony that while social media companies legally can decide what content to allow on their platforms, such censorship stifles free speech and results in biased coverage. What are your recommendations to these companies regarding content moderation without censorship?
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Rogers. I would first of all endorse at least the transparency that both you and Chairman Thompson stressed in your opening remarks. And in addition, other process-related guarantees such as due process, the right to appeal, and a clear statement of standards. I would also recommend standards that respect the free speech guarantees not only in the United States Constitution, but of international human rights that the United Nations Human Rights Council has recommended in a non-binding way that powerful companies adopt. And that would mean that content could not be suppressed unless it posed an emergency, that it directly caused certain specific, serious, imminent harm that can't be prevented other than through suppression. Short of that, as you indicated, for example, Ranking Member Rogers, politically controversial, even repugnant speech should be protected. We may very much disagree with the message, but the most effective as well as principled way to oppose it is through more speech. And I would certainly recommend, as I did in my written testimony, that these companies adopt user-empowering technology that would allow us users to make truly informed, voluntary decisions about what we see and what we don't see, and not manipulate us, as has been reported many times, into increasing rabbit holes and echo chambers, but give us the opportunity to make our own choices and to choose our own communities.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the young lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and I thank the ranking member, committee members for this hearing. Let me indicate that there is known to the public the fourth estate, and I might say that we have a fifth estate, which is all of you and others that represent the social media empire. And I believe it is important that we work together to find the right pathway for how America will be a leader in how we balance the responsibilities and rights of such a giant entity and the rights and privileges of the American people and the sanctity and security of the American people. Social media statistics from 2019 show that there are 3.2 billion social media users worldwide, and this number is only growing. That equates to about 42% of the current world population. That is enormous. And certainly I know the numbers are just as daunting in the United States. So let me ask a few questions, and I would appreciate brevity because of the necessity to try to get as much in as possible. On March 15th, 2019, worshipers were slaughtered in the midst of their prayers in Christchurch, New Zealand. The gunman live streamed the first attack on Facebook Live. So my question to you, Ms. Bickert, is that can you today assure the committee that there will never be another attack of this nature that will be streamed as it is happening over Facebook Live? You mentioned 30,300. And so I hope they may contribute to your answer, but I yield to you for your answer.
Congresswoman, thank you. And the video was appalling. The attack, of course, is an unspeakable tragedy. And we want to make sure we're doing everything to make sure it doesn't happen again and it's not live streamed again. One of the things we've done is we have changed access to Facebook Live so that people who have a serious content policy violation are restricted from using it. So the person who live streamed the New Zealand attack.
What is the
would not be able to
likelihood
do
of you
so.
being able to commit that that would not happen again in terms of the new structures that you put in place?
Well, the technology we're working to develop, the technology is not perfect. So artificial intelligence is a key component of us recognizing videos before they are reported to us. And this video was not about, fewer than 200 people saw it while it was live on Facebook.
So
Nobody
can you give
reported.
me, my time is short. Do you have a percentage, 50%, 60%?
With the technology, I can't give a percentage. I can say that we are working with governments and others to try to improve that technology so that we will be able to better recognize.
Mr. Pickles and Mr. Slater, if you would. Ms. Bickett did raise the question of artificial intelligence. And so if you would respond as to the utilization of AI and individuals as briefly as possible, please.
So one of the challenges Twitter has is that there's not a lot of content, 280 characters, a maximum of 2 minutes, 20 video. So one of the challenges in Christchurch was we didn't see the same video uploaded. We saw different snippets that took different lengths. So we're investing in technology to make sure that people can't re-upload content once it's been removed previously. We're also making changes to make sure that, for example, where people manipulate media, we can move quicker.
So you're using human subjects and AI?
It's machine learning and humans, yes.
All right, Mr. Slater.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We use simply a combination of machine learning and people to review. Speaking overall, in the first quarter of 2019, 75% of the 8 million videos we removed, they were first flagged by a machine, and the majority were removed before single view. When it comes to violent extremism, it's even stronger. So over 90% of the violent extremist videos that were uploaded and removed in the past 6 months were removed before a single human flag, and 88% with less than 10 views.
Thank you. Let me ask the question about deep fakes because my time is going. For each of you in the 2020 election, what you will do to recognize the fact that deep fakes can be a distortion of an election that is really the premise of our democracy. Can you quickly answer that question? At the same time, I just want to make mention of the fact that free speech does not allow incitement, fighting words, truth, threats, and otherwise. Could you just answer that, please?
Yes, Congresswoman.
The deep fakes, as briefly as you can.
Absolutely. We are working with experts outside the company and others to make sure that we understand how deepfakes can be used and come up with a comprehensive policy to address them. In the meantime, we're focused on removing fake accounts, which are disproportionately responsible for this sort of content, and also making sure that we're improving the speed at which we counter misinformation with actual factual articles and reduce the distribution.
Mr. Pickles.
So similarly, we're working on a product and policy solution, but one of the things that we already have in place is that if anyone presents any misinformation about how to vote, that lends to voter suppression, we will remove that now, and that policy has been in place for some time.
Slater.
Similarly, we're investing significantly in working with researchers and others to build capacities in the space. We have an intel desk that scans the horizon for new threats and constantly is looking at this sort of issue.
Thank you for your courtesy. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While we were sitting here today, I just looked up on the internet, put in Facebook apologizes, Google apologizes, Twitter apologizes, and there were more pages than I could count going through those apologies there. I listened closely to the words or how you framed it, both Mr. Pickles and Mr. Slater, when you talked about, one of you used hateful content, Mr. Pickles. Mr. Slater, you used the expression hate speech, and you listed several different people that were protected. What I did not hear you say in that group of people that you listed were those that were wanting to express their faith. In April, one of the larger apologies I think you guys have made in April, Kelly Harkness brought us to the attention of Abby Johnson's life story in a movie called Unplanned. That movie's gone on to make $20 million at the box office. But Google listed that as propaganda. My question for you today, was that a machine that listed that, or was that an individual?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with the specific video in question. I'd be happy to go back and.
It wasn't a video, it's a movie. It was one of the larger stories in April of this year, a major motion picture. And not familiar with that? Didn't come across your radar?
No, sir, I'm not familiar with that specific video.
Okay. All right. When we talk about the difference between hateful content and hate speech, I know Mr. Pickles, in June, just earlier this year, Marco Rubio brought the attention that Twitter was banning any kind of language that was maybe offensive to China. Later came back and apologized. Question for you is, how does Twitter use their discretion to block information without discriminating against different individuals or groups?
Well, firstly, as you say, our rules identify hateful conduct. So we focus on behavior first. So how do two accounts interact? And we look at that before we look at the speech that they're sharing. So there are offensive views on Twitter. There are views that people will disagree with strongly on Twitter. The difference between that and targeting somebody else is a difference between content and conduct. So our rules don't have ideology in them. They're enforced without ideology and impartially. And where we do make mistakes, I think it is important for us to recognize. I know one of the challenges we have is that where we remove someone from Twitter and they come back for a different purpose, our technology will recognize that person trying to come back on Twitter, and we don't want people to come back to the platform that we've removed. Sometimes that does catch people who are having a different purpose. So there is both a value to technology, but we should recognize where we made mistakes.
Mr. Slater, how does Google audit their content moderation policies to ensure that they are being followed and that they are not being driven by bias?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Speaking broadly, we have a robust system of both the development and the enforcement of our policies. We are constantly reviewing and analyzing the policies themselves to understand whether they are fit for purpose, whether they're drawing the right lines. Our reviewers go through extensive training to make sure we have a consistent approach. We draw those reviewers from around the country, around the world. Again, train them very deeply and are constantly reviewing and checking.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. I need to keep moving. What type of training, if any, do you provide for your human content moderators regarding subjectivity and avoiding bias, Mr. Slater?
Again, we provide robust training to make sure that we are applying a consistent rule.
Robust training. What does that mean? What's robust training?
So when reviewers are brought on board, before they are allowed to review, we provide them with a set of educational materials and detailed steps. In addition, they are reviewed by managers and others to make sure that they can correct mistakes, then learn from those mistakes, and so on.
Ms. Bicker, do you think that AI will ever get to the point where you can rely solely on it to moderate content, or do you think human moderation will always play a role?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. At least for the near future, human moderation is very important to this. Technology is good at some things. It's good at, for instance, matching known images of terror propaganda or child sexual abuse. It is not as good at making the contextual calls around something like hate speech or bullying.
Final couple questions as I wind down my time. Mr. Pickles, do you have any idea how many times Twitter apologizes per month for missing it on content?
I know that we take action on appeals regularly. Every decision we made.
You got a number on that?
I don't have a number offhand, but I can happily follow up.
Mr. Slater, do you have any idea how many times Google apologizes for mismanaging the content per month?
Congressman, similarly, we have an appeals process, so there are times where we don't get it right.
You have a number?
I do not today, but I would be happy to come back to you.
Yeah, I think you guys have apologized more than Kanye West has to Taylor Swift at some point. With that, I yield back. Yeah.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In March, 2 weeks after the Christchurch terror attack, Facebook announced it would start directing users searching for white supremacist terms to Life After Hate, an organization that works to rehabilitate extremists. Life After Hate is based in Chicago, so I met with them last month when I was at home in Illinois. They told me since Facebook's announcement, they've seen, quote, a large bump in activity that hasn't slowed down. Facebook and Instagram have 3 billion users combined. Life After Hate is a tiny organization whose federal funding was pooled by this administration. They do great work and simply don't have the resources to handle every single neo-Nazi on the internet on their own. Ms. Bickert, has Facebook considered providing continuous funding to Life After Hate for the duration of this partnership?
Congresswoman, thank you for that question. Life After Hate is doing great work with us. And for those who don't know, basically, we are redirecting people who are searching for these terms to this content. And we do this in some other areas as well. And like, for instance, with self-harm support groups. And we do see that sometimes they are under-resourced. So this is something that we can come back to you on, but we're definitely committed to making sure this works.
Okay, so right now there's no long-term funding commitment, but you'll consider it.
I'm not sure what the details are, but I will follow up with you on them. So
Facebook has made Life After Hate a significant component of its strategy against online extremism, and so we really would appreciate that follow-up with exact information. Mr. Slater, over the years, YouTube has put forward various policy changes in an attempt to limit how easily dangerous conspiracy theory videos spread. For example, YouTube announced over a year ago that it would display, quote, information cues in the form of links to Wikipedia next to the conspiracy videos. Mr. Slater, in the 15 months since this policy was announced, what percentage of users who view videos with information cues actually click on the link for more information?
Thank you for the question, and I think this is a very important issue. We do both display these sort of contextual cues to Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica, as well as take a number of other steps.
Right.
I don't have a specific percentage on how many have clicked through, but would be happy to come back to you.
Okay, if you can follow up in writing, that'd be appreciated. Most Wikipedia articles can be edited by anyone on the internet. We've all seen some with questionable content. Does YouTube vet the Wikipedia articles that it links to on information cues to ensure their accuracy, or do you all work with Wikipedia to ensure that the articles are locked against malicious edits?
We work to raise up authoritative information and ensure that what we're displaying is trustworthy and correct any mistakes that we may make.
So you all have corrected the Wikipedia pages if it's incorrect?
No, I'm sorry. We do, before we display such things, we look to ensure that we have a robust process to make sure that we're displaying accurate information.
The question is about what you're linking to.
Yes.
Okay, so can you just follow up with us in writing on that one? Great. Ms. Bickert, Facebook has displayed links to additional reporting next to content that contains disinformation. What percentage of users click through to read that additional reporting?
I don't have that percentage for you, Congresswoman. I'm sorry about that, but I will follow up in writing quickly.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, at this point, I'd like to ask the clerk to display the 2 screenshots my staff provided earlier on the TV screens. Last month, Instagram announced that it would hide search results for hashtags that display vaccine disinformation. So yesterday, I did a simple search for vaccine on Instagram from 2 different accounts. These are the top results. As you can see, the majority of these responses display anti-vax hashtags and popular accounts with titles like, quote, corrupt vaccines, quote, vaccines uncovered, and, quote, vaccine injury awareness. These are not niche terms. This content is not hard to find, and vaccine disinformation is not a new issue. Ms. Bickert, clearly Instagram's efforts here have some gaps. Anti-vax content is a deadly threat to public health. What additional steps can Instagram commit to taking to ensure that this content is not promoted?
Congresswoman, thank you for that question. And vaccine hoaxes and misinformation are really top of mind for us. And we have launched some recent measures, but I want to tell you how we're working to get better on those. One thing we're doing is when accounts are sharing misinformation, we are trying to downrank them and downrank them in the search results as well. That's something that's ongoing. It requires some manual review for us to make sure that we're doing that right, but we are getting better at that. Another thing is actually surfacing educational content, and we're working with major health organizations to provide that. So when people go searching for this, at the top of the search results, they will see that informational content. We're working with those health organizations right now, and we should have that that content up and running soon. And I can follow up with the details on that.
Please, while this is a new initiative for your organization, it's critically important that that information is shared with users at the time that they search for it, which we know is ongoing. Look, everyone in this room appreciates that online extremism and disinformation are extremely difficult problems that require broad, coordinated solutions. But these aren't new challenges, and failing to respond seriously to them is dangerous. The research is clear. Social media helps extremists find each other, helps make their opinions more extreme, and helps them hurt our communities. My constituents and I want strong policies from your companies that keep us safe. And while I truly believe that your current policies are well-intentioned, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And frankly, some of it should have been done already. I'm looking forward to working with your companies and my colleagues in Congress on broad, real solutions. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. It's obvious from this conversation that this is a very difficult area to maneuver in. And Ms. Strawson, I understand your concerns about First Amendment infringement, but I also understand and I applaud the company's desire to try and find that delicate balance. And quite frankly, since you're not a government entity, you have more flexibility in how you do that. And it's kind of up to you as the stewards of that flexibility to do the best job you possibly can. So I'm going to get back to you in a minute with a couple of questions, but I just want to follow up Mr. Slater to make sure I'm perfectly clear with what you're saying here. And I'm well aware from your testimony previously that what the policies and practices are at Google. But that video that Mr. Rogers did reference did show that people were, look like they're talking about a very serious political bias and their intent to implement that bias in their job. Whether or not that happened, I don't know. I'm not asking about the policies and practices. I'm asking you if you personally have ever been made aware of anyone that has done that, used political bias at Google to alter content, or whether they, first of all, have you ever heard that? Then Google. And I know what your policy and practice are, so I don't want a long answer. I just want to know if you've heard that.
Congressman, I'm not aware of any situation. Our robust checks and balances and processes would prevent that.
Okay, so you personally have not ever heard of that ever since your time at Google?
Correct.
Okay, and the movie and the allegation that Congressman Walker referenced about the abortion movie, you haven't heard nothing about people limiting contact with respect to that as well, context?
Congressman,
content.
I'm not familiar with that video, no.
Okay. All right, and you've never heard anybody limiting content in that regard for any sort of issue-oriented things?
Again, we would remove content where it violates our policies, but our policies with regard to ranking not about.
I'm aware what your policy practice. I'm just saying, have you ever heard that yourself? There's a difference. You understand the difference? It's not what your policies and practice are. It's what you're personally aware of.
Yes, Congressman, I believe I understand, and I am not aware of any situation like that.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want to talk to Mr. Slay, all of you here today. This internet forum, GIFCT, which is the lamest acronym ever, by the way, Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Can someone Mr. Pickles perhaps, could you just give me a little detail of what exactly the goal is of this, this forum?
Sure, and equally, as Facebook and Google have both chaired the organization, happy for them to add. I think the critical thing is GIFCT is about bringing together 4 companies who have expertise in investment on countering terrorism, but recognizing that the challenge is far bigger. So the 3 strands: support small companies. As we remove content, it goes across the internet. We need to help those small companies. Fund research so we can better understand. So we have a research network. And then finally, sharing technical tools. So you've heard people reference these digital fingerprints to make sure that whether it's a fingerprint or in Twitter's case, we share the URL. So if we take down an account for spreading a terrorist manual and we see it's linked to a company, we'll tell that other company, hey, the terrorist account is linked to something on your service, you should check it out.
It's similar to what you do in the malware arena, correct?
Yeah, so there's industry collaboration is really at the heart of it.
Okay, now what companies are members of this? Is there a whole bunch or is there just a limited number?
So when we founded it, it was Google, Twitter, YouTube, Twitter, Microsoft, and Facebook. Dropbox have now joined. One of the things we have is a partnership with Tech Against Terrorism, which allows small companies to go through a training process. So they learn things like how to write their terms of service, how to enforce their terms of service. And by mentoring them, that's where we're hopeful that we'll have more companies joining and growing this. But the hash sharing consortium has many members, 15 members. We share URLs with 13 companies. So it's broad, but we wanted to have a high standard. We want membership to be the companies who are doing the best. And that's why we want to keep a high bar and bring people in.
Understand it. Now, as far as the encrypted messaging platforms, I take it they're not all members of this. They're not all participants in this, are they?
I'm probably not the best place to answer that question. If,
would you know, Ms. Pickert?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. So the main members are, as Mr. Pickles mentioned, those 5 companies.
I
Now,
understand.
in terms of the smaller companies who've been trained, that does include some of the encrypted messaging services, because some of this is about just understanding what are the right lines to draw, how to work with law enforcement authorities, which encrypted communication services can definitely do.
So some of the my biggest concern is that while the big players in this field, all of you at the table, seem to be endeavoring to try and do the right thing, especially with respect to counterterrorism, that the encrypted messaging platforms, by and large, have a much broader field to play in, and doesn't seem to be much we can do to stop their content from spreading their filth and their violence. So I would love to hear any suggestions. I know my time is up, to perhaps in writing, as to how we could try and entice some of them to be part of this effort. The encryption is obviously a breeding ground for white supremacists, violence of all sorts, and trying to get the companies to be more responsible and just not worried about their bottom line profit making would be great to hear from you guys. So thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin, for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. I wanted to switch gears for just a second and talk about the influence and the spread of foreign-based information, foreign-based political ads in particular, in our political process. Many of us read the Mueller report page by page, and I was interested, Ms. Bickert, that the Facebook General Counsel stated, for the record, that for the low price of $100,000, the Russian Associated Internet Research Agency got to 126 million American eyeballs. And I'm interested in this because the political ads that they put forward were specifically targeted to swing states, and Michigan is one of those states. So we saw an overabundance of these ads. They were specifically paid for by foreign entities, and they were advocating for or against a candidate in our political process. I have a serious problem with that. So separate from the issues of speech and what an American does or does not have right to say, can you speak specifically to Facebook's reaction to the fact that they spread foreign purchased information? And it doesn't matter to me that it was Russian, it could be Chinese or Iranian, and what steps you have taken since 2016 to prevent the spread of foreign information.
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Thank you for the question. And this, where we were in 2016, I mean, we are in a much, much better place. And so let me share with you some of the steps we've taken. First of all of those ads came from fake accounts. And we have a policy against fake accounts, but we've gotten much better, and we had it then, but we've gotten much better at enforcing it. And now we are actually stopping more than 1 million accounts, fake accounts per day at the time of upload. And we publish stats on how many fake accounts we're removing every quarter, and you can see how much better we've gotten in the past 2 years. Another thing that we're doing with political ads specifically is we are requiring unprecedented levels of transparency. Now, if you want to run a political or political issue ad in the United States, you have to first verify your identity. You have to show you're an American, which means we actually send you something, because we have seen fake IDs uploaded from advertisers. We send you something through the mail, and you actually then get a code and you upload for us a government ID. So we verify that you are a real American. And then we also put a paid for disclaimer on the political ad, and we put it in an ads library we've created that's visible to everybody. So even if you don't have a Facebook account, you can go and see this ads library, and you can search what types of political ads are appearing, who's paying for them, and other information about how they're being targeted and so forth.
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear it. I would love to see if there are reports. I'd love to just be directed to them so I can see them. For the others at the table, can you talk about your specific, in brief, please, your specific policy on the spread of foreign political ads for or against a candidate running for office in the United States?
So the first thing we did was to ban Russia Today and all of its associated entities from using any of our advertising products going forward. We took all of the revenue from Russia Today and their associated entities and are funding research and partnerships with organizations like the Atlantic Council, like the Disinfo Lab in Brussels, to research better how we can prevent against this. We then took the unprecedented step of publishing every tweet, not just the paid for ones, every tweet that was produced by a foreign influence operation in a public archive. So you can now access more than 30 million tweets that runs to more than 1 terabyte of videos, photographs in a public archive. Those include operations from Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries?
Thank you for the question. Looking backwards at 2016, we found very limited improper activity on our platforms. That is a product of our threat analysis group and our other tools to root out that sort of behavior. Looking forward, we continue to invest in that, as well as our election transparency efforts requiring verification of advertisers for federal candidates, disclosure in the ads, and then a transparency report.
Great. What about the spread of information through bots? What kind of disclosure requirements so that when someone is receiving or viewing something, they have some way of knowing who produced it, who's spreading it, whether it's a human being, a machine? Why don't we start with Facebook?
Thank you, Congresswoman. One of our policies is that you have to have your real name and be using an account authentically. And so when we're removing bot accounts, we're removing them for being fake accounts. Those are all numbers that we publish.
Every week, we challenge between 8 and 10 million accounts for breaking our rules on suspicious activity, including malicious automation. So we're removing those accounts. About 75% of those 8 to 10 million challenge fail those challenges and are removed every week.
Congresswoman, for our part, we have strict policies about misrepresentation in ads, impersonation. We are looking out, again, through our threat analysis group for coordinated and authentic behavior, and we'll take action where appropriate.
Thank you. I know my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Slater, are you ready? Get your scripted answers ready, sir. Google and YouTube are developing quite a poor reputation in our nation. Clear history of repetitively silencing and banning voices. Conservatives or liberal doesn't concern me right now. We're talking about freedom of speech and access to open communications. We're here today to discuss extremist content, violent threats, terrorist recruiting tactics, and instigation of violence, yet the same justification your platform uses to quell true extremism is often used to silence and restrict the voices that you disagree with. We don't like it. For example, Prager University, a series of 5-minute videos which discuss political issues, religion, economic topics from a conservative perspective, has had over 50 of their videos restricted. Some of their restricted videos include why America must lead. Perhaps that's a question should be directed to the mirror. America leads because of our stance for freedom, for all voices to be heard. The 10 Commandments, do not murder, video pulled by your people. What's wrong with the 10 Commandments, might I ask? Why did America fight the Korean War? A legitimate reflection on a significant part of the history of our nation. Pulled. Additionally, YouTube removed a video from Project Veritas, which appears to show a senior Google executive acknowledging politically motivated search manipulation with an intent to influence election outcomes. None of us here want that on either side of this aisle. I don't know a man or woman present that's not a true patriot and love their country. We have varying ideological perspectives, yes, but we love our country and we'll stand for freedom, including against Google. A frequent reason provided by YouTube is that the content in question harmed the broader community. What could be more harmful than the broader community, than the restriction of our free speech and open communications, regardless of our ideological stance? Please define for America, what do you mean by harmed the broader community as it's used to justify restricting the content on Google or YouTube, and point out as harm limited to physical threats and the incitement of violence as it should be? Or is it a convenient justification to restrict the content that you deem needs to be restricted? Please explain to America how you determine what is harmed the broader community. What does that mean? Let's have your scripted answer.
Congressman, thank you for the question. I appreciate the concern and the desire to foster robust debate. We want YouTube to be a place where everyone can share their voice and get a view of the world.
But you don't allow everyone to share their voice. I've given examples in my brief time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing my time. The First Amendment protects Americans' right to express their viewpoints online. Is something that offends an individual or something an individual agrees with, does that meet your company's definition of extreme?
We have community guidelines that lay out the rules of the road about what is not permitted on the platform, including incitement to violence, hate speech, harassment, and so on. If you can clarify what you're asking about specifically, I'd be happy to try and answer.
Mr. Slater, God bless you, sir. Google's in a bind. Today, America is watching. Today, America is taking a step back. We're looking at the services, we're looking at the platforms that we use, and we're finding to our horror that they can't be trusted. Today, America is looking carefully at Google, and a word reverberates through the minds of America. Freedom. Shall it be protected? Shall it be preserved? Or shall it be persecuted and subject to the will and whim of massive tech companies? Mr. Chairman, thank you for recognizing my time, and I yield the balance. Thank you for holding this hearing today.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the young lady from New York for 5 minutes, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our panelists for appearing before us today. I want to go into the issue of deep fakes because I've recently introduced legislation, the first ever in a House bill, to regulate the technology. And if my bill passes, what it would do is it would make sure that deep fake videos include a prominent, unambiguous disclosure, as well as a digital watermark that can't be removed. And the question I have is whether your platforms, when it comes to your attention that a video has been substantially altered or entirely fabricated, how your companies decide whether to do nothing, label it, or remove it. And that's for the panel.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman.
Sure.
So when it comes to deep fakes, this is a real top priority, especially because of the coming elections. Right now, our approach is we try to use our third-party fact-checking organizations. There are 45 of them worldwide. And if they rate something as being false, they can also tell us that something's been manipulated. And at that point, we will put the information from the fact-checking organization next to it. So much like the label approach, this is a way of actually letting people understand that this is something that is in fact false. We also reduce the distribution of it. We are also looking to see if there's something we should do specifically in the area of deep fakes. We don't want to do something in a one-off way. We want to have a comprehensive solution. And part of that means we have to get a comprehensive definition of what it means to actually have a deep fake. And those are conversations that we look forward to having with you.
Yeah, my bill would require that there's a digital watermark. And that it shows how, similar to how your companies do sort of a hash of terrorist content. If there was a central database of deceptive deepfake hashes, would you agree to utilize that? Mr. Pickles.
I'm happy to pick up on that and the previous question. I was at a conference in London a few weeks ago hosted by the BBC and an NGO called Digital Witness. And they actually work on issues around verifying media from war zones of war crimes. And so I think actually this, as Monica says, this policy goes from a whole spectrum of content, from synthetic to edited to manipulated. So I think certainly from our point of view, every partnership is one we want to explore to make sure that we have all the information. And I think your framing of how, in some circumstances, there may be situations to remove content. In other circumstances, it's about providing context to the user and giving them more information. I think that's the best balance, I think, of making sure that we have all the tools available to us. And that's the approach that we're developing now.
Yeah, time is not your friend here. And what we're trying to find is something universal that creates transparency, respects the First Amendment, but also make sure that, it's something that as Americans whose eyes are constantly on video, something you can identify right away. If you have to go through all of these sources to determine, and each platform has a different way of indicating, it almost nullifies that. So I wanted to put that on your radar because I think that there needs to be some sort of a universal way in which Americans can detect immediately that what they're seeing is altered in some form or fashion. And that's what my bill seeks to do. Imagine if Russia just days before the 2020 election released a fake video of a presidential candidate accepting a bribe or committing a crime. If your companies learn of a deepfake video being promoted by a foreign government to influence our election, will you commit to removing it? How would you handle such a scenario? Have you thought about it? Give us your thoughts. I don't have a whole lot of time.
Congresswoman, we do have a real name requirement on Facebook, and we also have various transparency requirements that we enforce. So if it's shared by somebody not in a real name or otherwise violating our transparency requirements, we would simply remove it.
We actually have a clear policy on affiliated behavior. So activity affiliated with an entity we've already removed. And as I said, we've removed millions of tweets connected with the Internet Research Agency. We'd remove any activity affiliated with that organization.
Thank you for the question. It's a critical issue, and I think we would evaluate such a video under our policies, including our deceptive practices policies, and look as we would at any sort of foreign interference.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I look forward to talking to you further about this because we got to get to that sweet spot, and we're not there. It's very clear from your.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Recognize
Mr. Chairman.
gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Years ago, required reading I had was the book 1984. And this committee hearing is scaring the heck out of me. I have to tell you, it really is. Because here we are talking about if somebody Googles vaccines, the answer was, oh, we're going to put above what the person is actually looking for, what we think is best. Who are the people judging what's best, what's accurate? This is really scary stuff and really goes to the heart of our First Amendment rights. And so I don't always agree with ACLU, and you're the past president of ACLU, Ms. Strawson, but I agree with you wholly on this. We have to be very careful, my colleagues, on this, because what you deem as inaccurate, I do not deem as inaccurate, or other people may not deem. We had in a previous briefing on this issue, one of the members said, well, I think President Trump's tweets incite terrorism. Well, are we now going to ban what President Trump says because somebody thinks that it incites terrorism? This is some really scary stuff, and I'm very concerned, and I'm glad I'm part of this because, boy, we need more of us standing up for our rights, whether it's what you believe or what I believe. I have a specific question, and this is to Mr. Slater. In this Project Veritas video, which I did watch last night, they allege that there are internal Google documents, which they put on the video, and this is what it said. For example, imagine that a Google image query for CEOs shows predominantly men. Even if it were a factually accurate representation of the world, it would be algorithmic unfairness. In some cases, it may be appropriate to take no action if the system accurately affects current reality, while in other cases, it may be desirable to consider how we might help society reach a more and equitable state via product intervention. What does that mean, Mr. Slater?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I'm not familiar with the specific slide, but I think what we are getting at there is when we're designing our products, again, we're designing for everyone. We have a robust set of guidelines to ensure we're providing relevant, trustworthy information. We work with a set of raters around the world, around the country, to make sure that those search rater guidelines are followed. Those are transparent and available for you to read on the web.
All right, well, I personally don't think that answered the question at all, but let me go to the next one. You asked Mr. Clay Higgins a specific example. And so Mr. Slater, he was talking about Prager University. I just Googled and I use Google on Prager University, and it came up, and on Prager University website, it says, conservative ideas are under attack. YouTube does not want young people to hear conservative ideas. Over 10% of our entire library is under restricted mode. Why are you putting Prager University videos about liberty and those type of things on restricted mode?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate the question. To my knowledge, Prager University is a huge success story on YouTube with millions of views, millions of subscribers, and so on, remains so to this day. There is a mode that users can choose to use called restricted mode, where they might restrict the sorts of videos that they see. That is something that is applied to many different types of videos from across the board, consistent not with respect to political viewpoints, but applied to, for instance, The Daily Show, other sorts of channels as well. And to my knowledge, it's been applied to a very small percentage of those videos on Prager University. Again, that channel has been a huge success story, I think, with a huge audience on YouTube.
And Mr. Pickles, regarding Twitter, and President Trump has said, I think on multiple occasions, that he's accused Twitter of, people having a hard time being deleted from followers. This actually happened to my husband. He followed Donald Trump, and then all of a sudden, it was gone. So can you explain that? What is happening there? Why does that happen? Because I tell you, a lot of conservatives really think there's some conspiracy going on here.
Well, I can certainly look into the case of your husband to make sure there wasn't an issue there. And what I can say is that President Trump is the most followed head of state anywhere in the world. He is the most talked about politician anywhere in the world on Twitter. And although he did lose some followers when we recently undertook an exercise to clean up compromised accounts, President Obama lost far more followers in the same exercise. So I think people can look at the way that people are seeing President Trump's tweets widely and be reassured that the issues that you're outlining there are not representative in Twitter's approach.
And Mr. Chairman, I ran out of time, but if we have another round, I really want to hear from Ms. Strawson. I want to hear her views because she hasn't had a lot of time to speak. So I hope some of my fellow colleagues ask her. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes gentlelady from California, Ms. Barragon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is for Ms. Bickert, Mr. Pickles, and Mr. Slater. I want to talk a little bit about your relationship with civil society groups that represent communities targeted by terrorist content, including white supremacist content. I'm specifically referring to content that targets religious minorities, ethnic minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ, and others. Can you help by describing your engagement with civil society groups in the U.S. to understand the issues of such content and develop standards for combating this content?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, anytime that we are evolving our policies, which we're doing constantly, we are reaching out to civil society groups, not just in the US, but around the world. I have a specific team under me, actually, called Stakeholder Engagement. That is what they do. And when they're doing this, one of their jobs is to make sure, if, let's say we're looking at our hate speech policies, one of their jobs is to make sure that we are talking to people across the spectrum. So different groups that might be affected by the change, people who will have different opinions, all of those people are brought into the conversation.
Well, similarly, we have teams around the world who are speaking to civil society groups every day. Something we're also doing is training them. I think it's really important is that because Twitter's a unique public platform and a public conversation, when people actually challenge hatred and offer a counter narrative, offer a positive narrative, their views can be seen all over the world. So, Je suis Charlie was seen all over the world after an attack in Paris. Similarly, after Christchurch, Hello Brother, or even Hello Salam, which was a gentleman in Kenya who challenged a terrorist who was trying to separate Christians and Muslims. So we talk to civil society groups both about our policies, but also how they can use our platform more to reach more people with their messages.
Okay, and Mr. Slater, before you start, because I want to make sure you incorporate this, is one of my concerns is the onus to report the hateful content is placed on the very communities that are targeted by the hateful content. That can make social media platforms hostile places for people in targeted communities. So can you also tell us what your companies are doing to alleviate this burden? So Mr. Slater, and then I'll like to hear from the two of you on that.
Sure. Speaking of how we enforce our community guidelines, including against hate speech, including, again, as we said, we've updated our hate speech policies to deal with people expressing superiority, to justify discrimination, and so on. We use a combination of machines and people. Machines to scan across for broad patterns and so on, compared to previous violative content. So we do take our responsibility here very seriously, our ability to detect that first, review it before it's been flagged. And we're making great strides in that. We also do rely on flags from users, as well as flags from trusted flaggers, that is civil society groups, other experts who we work with very closely, both in the development of our policies and then again in flagging those sorts of videos.
Yeah, and so just to the two of you about the burden.
No, this is something that we've said previously. There was too much burden on victims. A year ago, 20% of the abuse we removed was surfaced proactively. That's now 40%. So in a year, we've been able to double the amount of content that we find proactively without waiting for a victim to review it. And we're continuing to invest to raise that number further.
Can you, the three of you, provide an example where you had community engagement and because of that feedback, there was a policy change that you made?
I can actually, let me share a slightly different example, which is how we write a better policy to prevent that. So when we were crafting our policy on non-consensual intimate imagery, that covers not just media shared by an ex-partner, but it might share creep shots, which I think have been, so various countries started asking, do you have a policy on creep shots? And because we'd spoken to those very civil society groups, our policy from the beginning was written broadly enough to capture not just the original problem, but all those different issues.
Ms. Bickert?
Yes, and let me address the second question that you asked about putting the burden on the victims. We have invested a lot in artificial intelligence. So there's certain times when artificial intelligence has really helped us and other areas where it's very much in its infancy. With hate speech, over the past few years, we've gone from 0 proactive detection to now, in the first quarter of this year, the majority of content that we're removing for violating our hate speech policies, we are finding using artificial intelligence and other technologies. So huge gains there. There's still a long way to go because all of those posts, after they're flagged by technology, have to be reviewed by real people who can understand the context. In terms of where our engagement has led to concrete changes, one thing I would point to is the use of hate speech in imagery. The way that we originally had our policies on hate speech, it was really focused on what people were saying in text. It was only through working with civil society partners that we were able to see how we needed to refine those policies to cover images too. And another thing I would point to is a lot of groups told us it was hard to know exactly how we defined hate speech and where we drew the line. That was a contributing factor, among many others, in why a couple years ago we published a very detailed version of our community standards where now people can see exactly how we define hate speech and how we implement it.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chair. I recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for some of the thoughtful discussion on how you combat terrorism online. I think there's worthy debates to be had there. And there's good questions on whether some of this content provides education so that we know of the bad things out there, or whether it's radicalizing people. Those are hard discussions to have, and I don't know that we're going to solve them today. But the problem is that the testimony doesn't stop there. The policies at your social media companies do not stop there. It doesn't stop at the clear-cut lines of terrorism and terrorist videos and terrorist propaganda. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what we're talking about. It goes much further than that. It goes down the slippery slope of what speech is appropriate for your platform and the vague standards that you employ in order to decide what is appropriate. And this is especially concerning given the recent news and the recent leaked emails from Google. They show that labeling mainstream conservative media as Nazis is a premise upon which you operate. It's not even a question, according to those emails. The emails say, given that Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Dennis Prager are Nazis, given that that's a premise, what do we do about it? 2 of 3 of these people are Jewish, very religious Jews, and yet you think they're Nazis. It begs the question, what kind of education do people at Google have? So they think that religious Jews are Nazis? Three of these people had family members killed in the Holocaust. Ben Shapiro is the #1 target of the alt-right, and yet you people operate off the premise that he's a Nazi. It's pretty disturbing. And it gets to the question, do you believe in hate speech? How do you define that? Can you give me a quick definition right now? Is it written down somewhere, Google? Can you give me a definition of hate speech?
Congressman, yes. So hate speech, again, as updated in our guidelines now, extends to superiority over protected groups to justify discrimination, violence, and so on, based on a number of defining characteristics, whether that's race, sexual orientation, veteran status.
Do you have an example of Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson or Dennis Prager engaging in hate speech? Do you have one example off the top of your head?
So, Congressman, we evaluate individual piece of content based on that content rather than based on the speaker.
Okay. Let's get to the next question. Do you believe speech can be violence? All right. There's not can you incite violence? That is very clearly not protected. But can speech just be violence? Do you believe that speech that isn't specifically calling for violence can be labeled violence and therefore harmful to people? Is that possible?
Congressman, I'm not sure I fully understand the distinction you're drawing. Certainly, again, incitement to violence or things that are encouraging dangerous behavior, those are things that would be against our policies.
Here's the thing. When you call somebody a Nazi, you can make the argument that you're inciting violence, and here's how. As a country, we all agree that Nazis are bad. We actually invaded an entire continent to defeat the Nazis. It's normal to say hashtag punch a Nazi because there's this common thread in this country that they're bad and that they're evil and that they should be destroyed. So when you're operating off of that premise, and frankly, it's a good premise to operate on, well, what you're implying then is that it's okay to use violence against them. When you label them, when one of the most powerful social media companies in the world labels people as Nazis, you can make the argument that's inciting violence. What you're doing is wholly irresponsible. It doesn't stop there. A year ago, it was also made clear that your fact check system is blatantly targeted at conservative newspapers. Do you have any comments on that? Are you aware of the story I'm talking about?
I'm not familiar with necessarily the specific story, Congressman. I am aware that from all political viewpoints, we sometimes get questions of this sort. I can say that our fact check labels generally are done algorithmically based on markup and follow-up on our policies.
For the record, they specifically target conservative news media, and oftentimes they have a fact check on there that doesn't even reference the actual article, but Google makes sure that it's right next to it so as to make people understand that that one is questionable, even though when you actually read through it, it has nothing to do with it. A few days ago, and this goes to you, Ms. Burkett, one of my constituents posted photos on Facebook of Republican women daring to say that there are women for Trump. Facebook took down that post right away with no explanation. Is there any explanation for that?
Without seeing it, it's hard for me to opine. That doesn't violate our policies, but I'm happy to follow up on the specific example with you.
Thank you. Listen, here's what it comes down to. If we don't share the values of free speech, I'm not sure where we go from here. This practice of silencing millions and millions of people, it will create wounds and divisions in this country that we cannot heal from. This is extremely worrisome. You've created amazing platforms. We can do amazing things with what these companies have created. But if we continue down this path, it'll tear us apart. You do not have a constitutional obligation to enforce the First Amendment, but I would say that you absolutely have an obligation to enforce American values, and the First Amendment is an underpinning of American values that we should be protecting until the day we die. Thank you, and thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Strawson, Chair going to take prerogative and allow you to make a comment.
Thank you so much for protecting my free speech rights, Mr. Chairman. The main point that I wanted to make is that even if we have content moderation that is enforced with the noblest principles, and people are striving to be fair and impartial, it is impossible. These so-called standards are irreducibly subjective. What one person's hate speech is, and an example was given by Congressman Higgins, is somebody else's cherished loving speech. For example, In European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which generally share our values, people who are preaching religious texts that they deeply believe in and are preaching out of motivations of love are prosecuted and convicted for engaging in hate speech against LGBTQ people. Now, I obviously happen to disagree with those viewpoints, but I absolutely defend their freedom to express those viewpoints. At best, these so-called standards, and I did read every single word of Facebook's standards, and the more you read them, the more complicated it is. And no two Facebook enforcers agree with each other, and none of us would either. So that means that we are entrusting to some other authority the power to make decisions that should reside in each of us as individuals as to what we choose to see and what we choose not to see, and what we choose to use our own free speech rights to respond to. And that, I think these platforms have, I cannot agree more about the positive potential, but we have to maximize that positive potential through user empowerment tools, through radically increased transparency. One of the problems of this—
I'm not going to limit your speech. I'm going to limit your time. Congressman
Thank you.
Correa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Thompson and the ranking member for holding this very critical hearing and very interesting, very important issues. I want to turn a little bit to the Russian interference in 2016. Mueller report outlines indictment of 13 Russians, three companies for conspiring to subvert our election system. 2018, we saw indications that, again, Russians were at it again. 2020, former Secretary of Homeland Security Nielsen, before she resigned, brought up the fact that the Russians were at it 2020 again. There's other countries also trying to affect our election system. And so I'm hearing your testimony, and my question, of course, Ms. Strawson, addressing the issue of First Amendment. Does the First Amendment cover fake videos online? We talked a little bit about the Pelosi fake video, and maybe you say yes. I probably say probably not, and I'll tell you why. Because that's a damaging video with false content, and although you may be private companies, when I hear my children tell me I saw it on this platform, the assumption is that it is factual. And Ms. Brickett, it took you 24 hours to take that video down. The others didn't take it down. You are essentially a messenger, and when your information shows up online, this population believes that you're credible and that information on there is probably credible too. And that's what's damaging to our country, to our democracy. Moving forward, we've got another election happening now. And as this information continues to be promulgated through your social media, through your companies, we have a First Amendment issue, but I have an issue also of democracy and keeping it whole. Any thoughts? Ms. Pickett?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We share the focus on making sure that we are ready.
24 hours is not fast enough. So are we playing here defense or offense? Are we reacting? Are you being proactive? So the next Nancy Pelosi video is something you can take down essentially faster than 24 hours.
Congressman, we are being proactive. I do agree that there's a lot that we can do to get faster. Our approach when there's misinformation is making sure that people have the context to understand it. We don't want people seeing it in the abstract. We want to make sure we're informing people, and we have to do so quickly. So that's something that we are focused on getting better at.
So let me ask you something. On the Pelosi video, who put it up?
It was uploaded by a regular person with a regular account.
So somebody at home with some very smart software and a good platform was able to put together a fake video and put it up?
Congressman, the technique that was used was to slow down the audio, which is the same thing we see a lot of comedy shows, frankly, do with a lot of
Okay.
politicians.
So what were the consequences to this individual for putting up essentially a video of somebody defaming, hurting her reputation?
Congressman, that video, our approach to misinformation is we reduce the distribution and then we put content from fact checkers next to it so that people can understand that the content is false or has been manipulated.
Mr. Pickles.
Well, one of the things we talked about earlier was how to provide context to users. So our focus now is developing.
Well, are your policies changing so that you'll be able to take it down next time, or are you just going to let it ride?
Well, we're looking at all of our policies in this area.
Are you going to look at taking it down, or are you going to let it ride? A yes or no?
Well, I think we're looking at both. How do you give more?
Mr. Slater, what are you going to do? I didn't get an answer. Sir, Mr. Slater, what are you going to do next time you see a video like this?
With respect to
It's
that video,
essentially
to be
false.
clear, we took it down under our deceptive practices policy.
And Ms. Strassman, not to, violate your freedom of speech here, you think this false videos online are constitutionally protected?
There is a very strict definition of false speech that is constitutionally unprotected. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that blatant, outright lies are constitutionally protected unless
So
they,
let me
for
switch in my
example, are-
seconds I have left. Will you write policy so outright lies do not have the devastating effect on our voters that they had in the 2016 election?
As I said, we're looking at the whole issue.
Thank you. Ms. Brickett, Mr. Slater, any thoughts?
We too, Congressman, are making sure that we have the right approach for the election.
Thank you. Mr. Slater.
Absolutely. We want to raise up authoritative content, reward it, and then demote borderline content, harmful misinformation, and remove violative content.
If I may say, this is exactly the reason why President Trump wants to change the libel laws, because it is now legal to lie about politicians and government officials.
Maybe there's an area we'll work together on some issues, huh? Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for being here. This has been very informative. Let me ask you a really quick question, yes or no? The Glyphosate, is that right? Glyphosate? GIFCT, your collaboration, does keeping your trade secret interfere with your sharing standards and, working together to, yes or no?
I don't think it has done, no.
Okay. I know you use this platform for terrorism. Do you use that platform at all for the sort of hate groups?
Not at present, but certainly after New Zealand, that highlighted that we do need to broaden our approach to different issues.
Mm-hmm. So, in my briefing, dog whistling has been mentioned as a certain kind of political messaging strategy that employs coded language to send a message. Certain groups that flies under the radar, and it's used by white supremacist groups often, and it is rapidly evolving on social media platforms, and it has its a space and targeting of racism and other sort of isms that we find abhorrent in this country. How do you solve the challenge of moderating dog whistle content on your platform, especially when it's being used to encourage these isms that we abhor so much?
I'm happy to start and then let others finish.
I'll take 1, 2, 3.
Sure. And well, sorry, start with me.
I'll take you any way you want to come.
Well, firstly, we enforce our rules, and one of the things that our rules are is about behavior. So if you're targeting somebody because of the membership of a protected characteristic, that's the important factor. The words come secondary. GIFCT has an entire stream of research. And one of the reasons for having that research stream is so that we can investigate what are the latest trends, what are the things we need to be learning about those kind of terms. And then finally, when we see whether it's different kinds of extremist groups, speaking for Twitter, we've banned more than 180 groups from our platform. for violent extremism across the spectrum, both in the US and globally. So we have a policy framework and also the industry sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would echo that a lot of this is about getting to the groups. We do have a hate speech policy, but beyond that, we know that sometimes there are groups that are just engaging in bad behavior. And so we ban not only violent groups, but also white supremacist groups and other hate groups. And we've removed more than 200 of them from our platform to date.
Thank you for the question. We do, as I said, remove hate speech on our platform. This is, and the sort of concerns you're talking about is what motivated the more recent changes. We also recognize that things may brush up against those policies, be borderline, but not quite cross them. And for those, we do work to reduce, demote them in the frequency and recommendations and so on.
Congresswoman, if I could have just 10 seconds.
I'm going to ask you a question. You can have a little bit more than that.
Thank you.
This is a very quick question. Ms. Vicker, did you bring any staff here with you today? Any employees from your?
Yes, we did.
Could you please have them stand up? For those that have accompanied Ms. Vicker, could you please stand up? Thank you very much. Mr. Pickles, you? Thank you. Mr. Slater. Thank you very much. Couple of things that you mentioned. You talked about making sure that people are real and that they're American when they're going to do advertisement. And you said, we're going to send information to you. You have to send it back. And it just simply proves that you may be pretending to be an American living and really living here or having a domicile here, an address here, still doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're legitimate. And so that's a challenge, I think, that we might have. Is that understandable, Mr. Slater, or am I confusing you?
If you could clarify the question, I would appreciate it.
Not a question, a statement. We were talking earlier about making sure that people who are doing political advertising, et cetera, are not foreign nationals, that they are Americans, that we not had this discussion about this advertisement, and it was stated by somebody there, thank you.
That's right.
That you do verification to make sure the person is an American, does live in America, and isn't this false whatever coming from another nation. I said, that really doesn't necessarily prove that, as far as I'm concerned.
Congresswoman, I'm just to clarify, that is Facebook's approach. We do verify.
I got to give her the 10%. I got to give her the 10%.
Oh, sorry. And we look at a government ID.
Because my question to you is, are there trigger words that come out of some of this speech that you think that should be protected, that needs to be taken down because it incites?
All of them, it's a problem. And I wanted to give an example from a story in Bloomberg News today that talked about YouTube's recent new policy of broadening the definition of unprotected hate speech. And on the very first day that it went into effect, one of the people that was suppressed was an online activist in the UK against anti-Semitism. But in condemning anti-Semitism, he was, of course, referring to Nazi expression and Nazi insignia, and hence he was kicked off.
So there's no trigger words. And it seems to me that I think it was Mr. Pickles, did you do the definition of hate speech for us earlier?
That was the hateful conduct under Twitter.
Yeah, I think that probably covers the President of the United States of America, unfortunately. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you all for being here. 2 months ago, in the immediate aftermath of the Christchurch incident, we sent out a letter to you all asking how much money are you spending on counterterror screening, and how many people do you have allocated to it? And we've had interesting conversations over those ensuing months, and the three basic problems that you have brought to me are that, one, that oversimplifies it because there's also an AI component to this. Well, yesterday we did a hearing that showed AI alone cannot solve this, impossible, and not into the future. You all agree with that. The second thing, though, that you have all said to me is that this is a collective action problem. We're all in this together, and we have the GIF CT. So I've got some very basic questions about the GIF CT. I'd appreciate if you could just immediately answer yes or no, and then we can get into the details. First question, does the GIF CT have any full-time employees? Ms. Pickard. No, no,
All right, Congressman.
does the gift CT have a full-time employee dedicated to it to run it?
No, we have people at Facebook full-time dedicated to GiftCT.
Okay.
The same, we have people at Twitter working with GiftCT, but we don't have, GiftCT doesn't.
Okay.
Yes, our answer is the same.
Does the gift CT have a brick and mortar structure? If I want to go visit the gift CT, could I do so, Ms. Bickert?
No, Congressman. We do host the database physically at Facebook.
Okay. Ms. Pickles?
No, our collaboration is 4 companies working together. We meet in person, we have virtual meetings. It's about collaboration, not about a physical building.
Ms. Slater?
That's right. Nothing further to add.
So no brick and mortar structure, but I presume you have a Google Hangout or maybe a Facebook Hangout. I don't know how you would decide that. But Adhesive and Sealant Council, an association located in Bethesda, Maryland, and the Adhesive and Sealant Council. It has 5 full-time staff. It has a brick and mortar structure. And you all cannot get your act together enough to dedicate enough resources to put full-time staff under a building dealing with this problem. I think it speaks to the ways in which we're addressing this with this technocratic libertarian elitism. And all the while, people are being killed. All the while, there are things happening that are highly preventable. AI. Are there any AI systems that any of you all have that are not available to the gift CT?
Congressman, yes, depending on how our products work, they all work differently. So artificial intelligence works differently. And we actually worked for some time on doing this. We had to come up with one common technical solution that everybody could use. We now have that for videos, and we do give it for free to smaller companies. But that's but one technique we have.
And please just keep it, I just want to know if you have any AI not that the gift CT doesn't have available.
Well, I'd also say that this isn't just AI. That's why we share URLs. Very low tech, low-fi, but if you're a small company and someone gives you a URL to content, you don't need AI to look at that. So I think that's why it's a combination solution.
Yes, nothing further to add to those comments.
Okay, my understanding is that there were no officially declared POCs for the gift CT that were made public from each company until after the Christchurch shooting. I know that they were there, but they were not declared established POCs at each of your companies until after the Christchurch shooting 2 months ago. Is this the case?
Congressman, we have a channel that people can use that gets routed to whoever is on call from our.
But is that the case that there were no established POCs? And this is the information you all have given me already. I'm just asking you to put it on the record. No established POCs at the gift CT until after the Christchurch shooting. Is that correct?
Perhaps not publicly listed, but certainly people know who to.
No established public POCs until after the Christchurch shooting.
Well, I draw a distinction between the POCs and the companies. We work together every week, every day. I think the point you're getting at is crisis response. I'm
getting to the fact that you're not taking it seriously because there's no public building, there's no full-time staff, there were no public POCs until after the Christchurch shooting.
Well, I think
that's what I'm speaking to. How is anyone supposed to think that you all take this collective action problem seriously if you have no one working on it full time? This is not something that technology alone can solve. This is a problem that we are blaming the entire industry for, rightfully so. And there are the smallest of associations in this town and throughout the country that do so much more than you do, and it is insulting. It is insulting that you would not at least apologize for saying that there were no established POCs prior to the Christchurch shooting. It was a joke of an association. It remains a joke of an association, and we have got to see this thing dramatically improved. Lastly, if there were terrorist content shown to be on your platforms by a public entity, would you take it down? So, Ms. Bicker, why, when the Whistleblower Association reveals that Facebook is establishing, through its AI platform, Al-Qaeda community groups, such as this one, a local business, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, with 217 followers. I have it right here on my phone by the Whistleblower Association. It is considered the most active of Al-Qaeda's branches or franchises that emerged due to weakening central leadership. It is a militant Islamist organization primarily active in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Why is this still up? We have every right now to feel as if you are not taking this seriously. And by we, I do not mean Congress, I mean the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Dimmons, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. We have already talked about the massacre at the Christ Church, and we also know that it was law enforcement who notified Facebook about what was going on. Ms. Bickert, I'd like to know if you could talk a little bit about your work and relationship with law enforcement and share some of the specific things that you are doing to further enhance your ability to work with law enforcement to continue to work to prevent incidences like this from happening again.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We have a special point of contact from our law enforcement engagement team. So people from within our company, usually former law enforcement, who are assigned to each company. And those relationships are well functioning and are the reason that New Zealand law enforcement were able to reach out to us. And once they did, within minutes.
You surely believe that they would have been able to reach out to you if you didn't have a law enforcement team, right? Wouldn't that have been part of their responsibility? Any law enforcement agency that saw what was happening live on your platform to notify you?
Congressman, we want to make it very easy. If they see something that they know exactly where to go. It's also a reason. So here with New Zealand, when they reached out to us, we responded within minutes. We also have an online portal through which they can reach us, and that is manned 24 hours a day. So if there's any kind of emergency, we're on it. Finally, if we see that there's an imminent risk of harm, we proactively reach out to them. I will also tell you, anytime that there's a terror attack or some sort of mass violence in the world, we proactively reach out to law enforcement to make sure that if there are accounts we should know about or names of victims, any sort of action that we should be taking, that we are on it immediately.
Okay, moving right along, Mr. Pickles, you said that we will not solve the problems by moving content alone. Is that correct, what you said? Okay, and I know that most companies do a pretty good job in terms of combating or fighting child exploitation or pornography. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit about your efforts to combat terrorism and share some of the similarities, because we can't solve the problems by just taking down content alone. So if you could just show some of the similarities in terms of your efforts of combating terrorism, along with your efforts to combat child pornography. I know you put a lot of resources in combating child pornography, rightly so, but could you talk about the similarities in the two goals?
Absolutely. What we have, there's similarities and differences. In the similarities space, we are able to use similar technology to look for an image we've seen before. If that appears again, we can proactively detect that image and stop it being distributed. And then critically work with law enforcement to bring that person to, so we work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who work with law enforcement around the world. So that process of discovering content, working with law enforcement is seamless, because I think, particularly for child sexual exploitation, but also for violent threats.
So what about for combating terrorism?
So I think in either case, if someone is posting that content, removing the content is our response. But there's a law enforcement response there as well, which holds people to account, potentially prosecutes them for criminal offenses. And that working in tandem between the two is very important. We have a similar industry body that shares information. And we also work with governments to share threat intelligence and analysis of trends so that we can make sure we're staying ahead of bad actors. But the biggest area and the next opportunity to improve.
Okay, all right, thank you. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about, the chairman asked a question about, or referenced the video of the speaker and why some of you removed it and some did not. And Mr. Slater, I was so pleased to hear your answer, which was, you look for deceptive practices It was deceptive, you removed it, correct? Could you just talk a little bit more about, it seemed like such a, because, and Ms. Strawson, if you would, I believe you said that the social media platforms' free speech right is their ability to decide what is posted and what is not posted. Exactly. It's just that simple, right? They can decide what is posted and what's not posted. So, Mr. Slater, if you could just talk a little bit about your process, and it was deceptive, you took it down.
Happy to, Congresswoman. Important question. And we have community guidelines. One of those guidelines is about deceptive practices. We review each bit of content thoroughly to make sure whether it is violative or whether it may fit into an exception, education, documentary, and so on and so forth, and do that on a individualized basis to see if the context has been met. And we present those guidelines publicly on our website for anyone to read.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a quick question. So is Google an American company?
Congressman, we are headquartered in California, yes.
Are you loyal to the American Republic? I mean, is that something you think about, or you think of yourself as an international company?
We build products for everyone. We have offices all across this country, have invested heavily in this country, and are proud to be founded and headquartered in this country.
Do you, so if you found out that a terrorist organization was using Google products, would you stop that? Would you end that?
We have a policy, Congressman, of addressing content from designated terrorist organizations to prohibit it, make sure it's taken down.
I'm not asking about content. I'm saying if you found a al-Nusra terrorist organization was using Gmail to communicate inside that terrorist organization, would you stop that? Do you have a policy? Do you have a policy on that? If you don't have a policy, that's fine. I'm just trying to, where are you on this?
Certainly, where appropriate, we will work with law enforcement to provide information about relevant threats, illegal behavior, and so on. And similarly, we'll respond to valid requests for information from law enforcement.
I'm not asking if you respond to subpoenas, and I appreciate that. It's good to hear that you deign to be legal. What I'm asking is, if a terrorist organization uses a Google product and you know about that, do you allow that to continue? Or do you have a policy?
I think in appropriate circumstances and where we have knowledge, we would terminate a user and provide information to law enforcement.
Okay, so you'll forgive me for not, your answer is a little opaque. I'm still trying to figure this out. So if a terrorist organization is using a Google product, do you have a policy about what to do about that?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm attempting to articulate that policy. I'd be happy to come back to you with further information if it's unclear.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Listen to the answer about referring it to law enforcement. I think that's an appropriate response, because if there is a suspicion that criminal activity is afoot, you would want to refer it to law enforcement, and law enforcement make the call on that.
Sure.
So just to kind of maybe help you a little bit with that particular portion of it, but
thanks, Chief.
Back to the policy. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So, and just to kind of follow up with that, so the Islamic Republic of Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, right? They are a terrorist, pieces of the Islamic Republic are terrorist organizations. Do you have a specific ban on that terrorist organization and their ability to use your Google products?
Congressman, we have prohibitions on designated terrorist organizations using products, uploading content, and so on.
Okay, so you seek to ban terrorist organizations from using Google products. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to understand your position.
Designated terrorist organizations, yeah, prohibitions on that sort of organization, correct?
So, and I'm not just asking about content. I'm asking about the services you provide, right? You provide Gmail, you provide iCalendar, you provide a whole host of different services that people can use. I'm trying to ask about the services, not the content. I realize that the focus of this hearing is about content, which is why you're here, but I'm asking about the actual services.
Right. To the best of my knowledge, if we were to have knowledge, and again, as my colleagues have said, these bad actors are constantly changing their approaches, trying to game the system and so on, but we do everything we can to prohibit that sort of illegal behavior from those sorts of organizations.
Do you have screens set up to try to figure out who the users are, to try to, pierce the veil, so to speak, and to an anonymous account, figuring out where that is or who that might be, where it's sourcing from? Are you looking at that? Is that part of how you operate as an organization that Google does?
Absolutely, Congressman. We use a combination of automated systems, threat analysis to try and ferret out behaviors that may be indicative in that way.
All right, thank you. I appreciate your answers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the panel for being here. This is an important topic, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the young lady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard a lot about incidents, but we haven't mentioned much about one that occurred in my district of Las Vegas. This was the deadliest shooting in the United States in modern history, October 1st, 2017. Gunman opened fire on a music concert, a festival, and after that attack, there was a large volume of hoaxes, conspiracy theories, misinformation that popped up all across your platforms, including about a misidentity of the gunman, his religious affiliation, and some of the fake missing victims. Some individuals even called it a false flag. In addition, when you put up a search safety check site on Facebook, and where loved ones could check in to see who was safe and who wasn't, there were all kinds of things that popped up, like links to spam websites that solicited Bitcoin donations. They peddled false information, claiming that the shooter was associated with some anti-Trump army. Just a lot of mess there where people were trying to make contact. I wonder if you have any specific policy or protocols or algorithms to deal with the immediate aftermath of a mass shooting like this. All three of you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And let me say that the Las Vegas attack was a horrible tragedy, and we think we have improved since then, but I want to explain what our policies were even then and how we've gotten better. So with the Las Vegas attack, we remove any information that is praising that attack or the shooter, and we also took steps to protect the accounts of the victims. Sometimes in the aftermath of these things, we'll see people try to hack into accounts or do other things like that. So we take steps to protect the victims, and we also worked very closely with law enforcement. Since then, one area where we've gotten better is crisis response in the wake of a violent tragedy. So for instance, with Christchurch, you had these companies at the table and others communicating real time, sharing with one another URLs, new versions of the video of the attack, and so forth to make sure. And it was literally a real time for the first 24 hours operation where we were sharing. In that first 24 hours, on Facebook alone, we were able to stop 1.2 million versions of the video from hitting our site. So we've gotten a lot better technically, but this is an area where we'll continue to invest.
Thank you. And as you've just heard, I think one of the challenges we have in this space is different actors will change their behavior to try and get around our rules. One of the things that we saw after Christchurch, which was concerning, was people uploading content to prove the event had happened. So the suggestion that because companies like ours were removing content at scale, people were calling that censorship. So there were people uploading content to prove the attack had happened. That's a challenge that we haven't had to deal with before, and it's something we're very mindful of, and we need to figure out what's the best way to combat that challenge. We have policies against the abuse and harassment of the survivors and victims and their families. So if someone's targeting someone who's been a victim or a survivor and is denying the event took place or is harassing them because of another factor like political ideology, we would take action for the harassment in that space. And then finally, the question of how we work with organizations to spread the positive message going forward. So that's where, if there's groups in your communities who are affected by this and working with the victims to show the kind of the positivity of your community, then we'd be keen to work with those organizations wherever they are in the US to spread that message of positivity.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. This is of the utmost seriousness. It was a tragic event, I think, for our country, for society, Personally, someone who lived in both Las Vegas and New Zealand, both of these events I hold deeply in my heart. We take a threefold approach to the sort of misinformation and other conduct that you were talking about. We try and on YouTube raise up authoritative sources of information, particularly in those breaking news events, to make sure that authoritative sources outpace those who might wish to misinform and so on. We will strike, remove denials of well-documented violent events or people who are spreading hate speech towards the survivors of that event. And we will also seek to reduce exposure to content that is harmful misinformation, including on conspiracies and the like.
Well, these people have already been victimized in the worst sort of way. You hate to see them then become victims of something that occurs over the internet. One thing we heard from law enforcement was that you might think about, and I think this relates kind of what you were saying, Mr. Slater, using your logarithms to elevate posts that come from law enforcement. So people seeking help go to those first as opposed to some of this other information just that comes in randomly. And you're working with law enforcement, have you considered that? I know you were addressing the chief's questions earlier. Ms. Bicker.
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's something that we can explore with law enforcement. We certainly try to make sure that people have accurate information after attacks. Our systems didn't work the way we wanted them to after Las Vegas. We learned from that, and I think we're in a better place today.
I'd appreciate it if you'd look into that. I think law enforcement would too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, to our representatives from Facebook, Google, and Twitter, I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for previously appearing for a closed briefing that we had earlier this year. And so we seek to continue to examine this complex issue of balancing First Amendment rights against making sure that content that is on social media does not promote terroristic activity. And Professor Strawson, you were not here during that closed briefing, so I want to ask a couple questions to you. During your testimony, your written testimony, you highlight the potential dangers associated with content moderation. Even when done by private companies in accordance with their First Amendment rights. You make a case for social media companies to provide free speech protections to users. You even state in the conclusion of your written testimony, you say how to effectively counter the serious potential adverse impact of terror content and misinformation is certainly a complex problem. While restricting such expressions might appear to be clear, a simple solution, it is in fact neither, and moreover, it is wrong. Now, I know you, that was a conclusion of an 11-page report that you provided, but could you just briefly summarize that for the purpose of this hearing?
Thank you so much, Congressman Guest. Yes, the problem is the inherent subjectivity of these standards. So no matter how much you articulate them, and I think it's wonderful that Facebook and the other companies have now fairly recently shared their standards with us, you can see that it is impossible to apply them consistently to any particular content. Reasonable people will disagree. The concept of hate, the concept of terror, the concept of misinformation are strongly debated. One person's fake news is somebody else's cherished truth. Now, a lot of attention has been given to the reports about discrimination against conservative viewpoints in how these policies are implemented. I want to point out that there also have been a lot of complaints from progressives and civil rights activists and social justice activists complaining that their speech is being suppressed. And what I'm saying is that no matter how good the intentions are, no matter who is enforcing it, whether it be a government authority or whether it be a private company, there is going to be, at best, unpredictable and arbitrary enforcement, and at worst, discriminatory enforcement.
And let me ask you, as an expert in the First Amendment, do you feel that content moderation by social media companies has gone too far?
I think that, first of all, they have a First Amendment right. I think that's really important to stress. But given the enormous power of these platforms, which, as the Supreme Court said in a unanimous decision 2 years ago, that this is now the most important forum for the exchange of information and ideas, including with elected officials, those who should be accountable to we the people. So if we do not have free and unfettered exchange of ideas on these platforms for all practical purposes, we don't have it. And that is a threat to our democratic republic, as well as it is to individual liberty. And there's a lot that these platforms can do in terms of user empowerment so that we can make our own choices about what to see and what not to see, and also information about that will help us evaluate the credibility of the information that's being put out there.
And finally, Ms. Dawson, do you have any recommendations that you feel would help balance First Amendment, individuals' First Amendment rights versus trying to protect social media from terrorists being able to use that as a platform, that you would recommend first to the social media companies? And then are there any recommendations that you would have of this body, things that Congress should consider that would help us as we navigate this very difficult situation?
I think that Congress's oversight, as you're exercising very vigorously, is extremely important. I think encouraging but not requiring the companies to be respectful of all of the concerns, human rights concerns of fairness and transparency and due process, as well as free speech, but also concerns about potential terrorism and dangerous speech. I actually think that the United States Supreme Court and international human rights norms, which largely overlap, have gotten it right. They restrict discretion to enforce standards by insisting that before speech can be punished or taken suppressed, that there has to be a specific and direct, tight causal connection between the speech in that particular context which causes an imminent danger. And we can never look at words alone in isolation, to get back to the question that I was asked by the Congresswoman, because you have to look at context. If in a particular context there is a true threat, there is intentional incitement of imminent violence, there is material support of terrorism, there is defamatory statements, there is fraudulent statements, all of that can be punished by the government, and therefore those standards should be enforced by social media as well. That would give us, in my view, that is exactly the right way to strike the balance here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Reverend Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm have a little different approach than my colleagues. Ms. Strawson, in 1989, I was a member of City Council in Kansas City, and the Klan had planned a big march in Swope Park. All this is still online. You can look at it. And I fought against them, and the ACLU supported the right to march, and that if I had passed an ordinance, I was also vice mayor at the time, if I passed an ordinance, they would challenge it in court. I'm not mad. I'm not upset. I'm a former board member of the ACLU, and so I think that free speech has to be practiced even when it's aberrant. Now, for everybody else, in some ways, I kind of feel sorry for you. Not enough to let you out without beating up on you a little bit, but I'm afraid for our country. I mean, we have entered an age of respected people, where people respect an alternative truth, and it is just so painful for me to watch it, and I don't think I'm watching it in isolation. Alternative truth is people will say something that's not true and continue to say it. It doesn't matter. I saw it last night where the president said, Barack Obama started this border policy, and I'm correcting it. And what they did, and this is what I want you to consider, what one of the TV networks did is put up people making statements about what was happening. They showed Jeff Sessions when he had first announced the separation policy and so forth. And the problem is that Churchill said that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts on its shoes, and that is true. That is, if we started a 20th century new Bible, that should be one of the scriptures, because it's a fact, and the truth cannot always be uncontaminated with sprinkles of deceit. So you guys have a tough job. I don't want to make it seem like it's something that you can do easily. Our system of government, I think, even beyond that, our moral connections depend a lot more. And I didn't realize this. I spent 3.5 years in seminary. I didn't realize this until recently. But we depend significantly on shame. I mean, there are some things that laws can't touch. And so our society functions on shame. And so when shame is dismembered, I'm not sure what else we have left. But what I would like for you to react to and maybe even consider is, instead of taking something down in some instances, why not just put up the truth next to it? I mean, the truth. I'm not talking about somebody else's response. I'm talking about the truth, where you put, like the video, I wish I could have brought it to you, where they said, here's the lie and here's the truth. Anybody help me? Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, anybody else?
So this is a very important issue, Congressman.
Yes, that's why, yes.
Absolutely. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is twofold with respect to harmful misinformation. So one is where there is a video that says, say, the moon landing didn't happen.
And my grandmother said that.
Or the earth is flat. Video may be up, but you will see a box underneath it that says, here's a link to the Wikipedia page about the moon landing, or the Encyclopedia Britannica page, where you can go and learn more. I think that speaks to
that's what I'm talking
the sort of feature that you're talking about. The other thing we try and do is...
You do that now?
We do that today. Yes, sir. And the other thing we try and do is reduce the exposure, the frequency of the recommendations to information that might be harmful misinformation, such as those sorts of conspiracies.
Thank you.
Well, I think you rightly highlighted the interplay between what's on social media companies, the news media, what's on TV, and how that cycle of information works together is a critical part of solving this. I think the one thing that for Twitter, because we're a public platform, very, very quickly people are able to challenge, to expose, to say that's not true, here's the evidence, here is the data. There is something incredibly important about these conversations taking place in public that I think is something, as we move into the information century, we need to bear in mind.
Thank you.
Congressman, thank you. Similar to what my colleague referenced, we actually, if there's something like misinformation that a third-party fact-checking organization has debunked, and we work with 45 of these organizations worldwide, they all meet objective criteria, they're all Pointer certified. What we do is we actually take the articles from those fact-checkers and put it right next to the false content so that people have that context. And we say, if you go to share some of that content, we say this content has been rated false by a fact checker, and we link them to it. Similarly, when it comes to things like misinformation about vaccines, we are working with organizations like the CDC and the World Health Organization to get content from them that we can actually put next to vaccine-related misinformation on our site. We do think this is a really important approach. It obviously takes a lot of resources. Another thing we're trying to do is, I guess what I would say is empower those, and this is similar to what Mr. Pickles mentioned, empower those who have the best voices to reach the right audience on this. So we invest heavily in promoting counter speech and truthful speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Before we close, I'd like to insert into the record a number of documents. The first of several letters from stakeholders addressed to Facebook as well as Twitter and YouTube about hateful content on their platform. The second is a joint report from the Center for European Policy Studies and the Counter Extremism Project. The third is a statement for the record from the Anti-Defamation League. The fourth are copies of community standards as of this day for Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Without objections, so ordered. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The other point I'd like to make for Facebook, you were 30 hours late with your testimony, and staff took note of it, and for a company your size, that was just not acceptable for the committee, so I want the record to reflect that. Without objections, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.
We had Grace under pressure.
I'm a white male and I am prejudiced. And the reason it is something I wasn't taught, but it's kind of something that I learned. I don't like to be forced to like people. I like to be led to like people through example. And what can I do to change, to be a better American?
That was